After 5 years of total silence, the man who traded our 15-year marriage for a woman half his age was standing on my doorstep. He looked different, older, thinner, that same frantic energy in his eyes I remembered from the worst night of my life, except it wasn't excitement anymore. It was desperation. He told me he'd made a terrible mistake. He said he'd never stop thinking about me. It was a version of history he'd clearly rehearsed, conveniently edited to leave out exactly why our marriage actually ended. What I didn't understand yet, standing in that doorway looking at a man I hadn't seen in 5 years, was that his sudden, tearful remorse wasn't the whole story. It wasn't even most of the story. Somewhere underneath the apology, the confession, the pleading look in his eyes, was something considerably colder, a financial and legal entanglement he hadn't come anywhere close to being honest with me about, one that would take me weeks to fully uncover, and that would ultimately reveal his return had almost nothing to do with missing me at all. My name is Monica. I'm 48 years old. And this is the story of the day my ex-husband showed up at my door claiming he wanted me back, and what I found out, 3 weeks later, about what he actually wanted. I need to take you back 5 years, because you can't understand why his return didn't shatter me without understanding exactly how thoroughly he'd shattered me the first time. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd made his favorite meal, lasagna, the kind that takes half a day to put together properly, even though we'd been distant for months by that point, living like polite, exhausted roommates in a house that used to be full of noise and laughter. I'd told myself it was a phase. A slump. The kind of thing every 15-year marriage goes through and eventually comes back from, if both people are willing to try. He came home late that night, long after the lasagna had gone cold on the stove. He didn't look at me. He just stood in the doorway of our kitchen and said the 6 words that ended my entire life as I understood it. I've met someone. I asked who. He wouldn't say a name at first, just kept describing her in vague, glowing terms, different, exciting, full of life, until I pushed hard enough that he finally admitted it. She was 24. I was 43. That number sat in the air between us like something physical, something suffocating. It wasn't just a breakup. It felt like a verdict, delivered without a trial, on exactly how much I was worth. The specific, humiliating math of it, 19 years younger than me, made the pain considerably more complicated than ordinary heartbreak. It wasn't just that he'd left. It was that he'd left for a version of what I used to be, as though every year I'd spent building a life and a marriage with him had become, overnight, evidence against me rather than a shared history worth protecting. I remember asking him, in the middle of that conversation, how long it had been going on, a question he answered with a specific evasiveness that told me almost as much as any direct answer could have. He said, a while, refusing to give me an actual timeline, and I remember standing there doing the math anyway, running back through the previous several months in my head, trying to place which specific dinners, which specific nights he'd claimed to be working late, might have actually belonged to someone else entirely. I never did get a straight answer to that question, not that night and not in the years since, and I've had to make my own uneasy peace with an incomplete timeline I'll likely never fully fill in. He packed a bag that same night. As he walked out the door, he turned and said something I have never once forgotten, in 5 years, no matter how hard I've tried. I'm sorry. I just need to feel young again. The silence he left behind that night was louder than any fight we'd ever had in 15 years. That first year is still, in my memory, mostly a blur, grief and paperwork tangled together in a way that made it hard to know, on any given day, which one I was actually drowning in. The house felt enormous and hollow. I'd wake in the middle of the night reaching for him out of 15 years of habit, only to feel the specific, cold emptiness of a bed built for 2 people, now holding only one. I want to describe the particular shame that settled over me during that period, because I think it's different from ordinary grief, and different from what people expect when they hear, "My husband left me." It wasn't just loss. It was a specific, gnawing comparison, not just to her, the 24-year-old with the whole unlived future ahead of her, but to the woman I used to be before I'd spent 15 years folding myself into someone else's life. I'd walk into the grocery store wondering who already knew, who was quietly pitying me, who was, somewhere in their own head, running the same cruel math I couldn't stop running myself. I remember, specifically, running into a former coworker of Mark's at the pharmacy about 4 months in, a woman who'd clearly heard the news and who greeted me with a kind of exaggerated, overly gentle sympathy that felt, in the moment, almost worse than open judgment would have. I drove home from that pharmacy and cried in my car for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside, not because of anything she'd actually said, but because of the specific, unbearable confirmation that my private devastation had become a piece of public knowledge, discussed and pitted by people I barely knew. Friends told me, the way friends always do, that I was better off without him. The words felt hollow every single time, because they didn't account for the specific, private hell of losing not just a partner, but the entire architecture of an adult life, the friends we'd built together, the routines, the future I'd spent 15 years quiet assuming was solid ground under my feet. The actual turning point, when it came, wasn't cinematic. About 6 months in, I was sitting on my closet floor, surrounded by boxes of his old clothes I still hadn't been able to make myself throw away, and I caught my own reflection in the mirror across the room. Pale. Thin. Utterly defeated. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. And in that specific, quiet moment, something other than grief finally sparked, anger, not really at him, not even at her, but at myself, for having let this particular loss dictate every single thing about who I was allowed to become next. That was the day I decided I was done being a supporting character in his story that I want to describe, briefly, the specific process of telling other people what had happened, because I think the way news like this spreads through a life adds its own particular texture to the grief. My sister was the first person I called, that same night, sitting on my bathroom floor because it was the only room in the house that still felt like mine. She drove over immediately, said almost nothing useful in the way people rarely do in that first raw hour, and simply stayed, which turned out to be exactly what I needed more than any specific words could have provided. Telling our mutual friends was harder, in a different way. Several of them, I learned later, had suspected something was happening in the months before Mark actually left, small observations they hadn't felt comfortable raising with me directly at the time. Hearing that afterward produced its own complicated grief, a specific loneliness in understanding that the unraveling of my marriage had apparently been visible to people around me before it was fully visible to me, living inside it every day that I want to walk through the specific, unglamorous steps of what actually followed, because I think the real rebuilding process matters more than the highlight reel version most people tell. I think it's worth saying, clearly, that this rebuilding didn't happen in a straight line. There were setbacks throughout, weeks where I regressed entirely, where I found myself back on that same closet floor for reasons I couldn't always identify, where the progress I thought I'd made felt like it had evaporated overnight. I don't want to present the next several years as some clean, uninterrupted upward climb, because that wouldn't be honest, and I think presenting it that way would do a disservice to anyone listening who's currently in the middle of their own messy, non-linear version of this same process. The first step was boxing up everything of his still in the house, his favorite mug, an old sweatshirt, our wedding photographs, each object its own small, brutal goodbye. The next step, harder in a different way, was a therapist's office, where I spent months doing the genuinely difficult work of untangling my own sense of worth from a marriage that had just publicly, humiliatingly ended. I learned, slowly, to understand his decision as a reflection of whatever was actually happening inside him, rather than an accurate measurement of anything true about me. I started small. A pottery class, taken almost on a dare to myself. The specific feeling of shapeless clay actually becoming something under my own hands felt, at the time, like more than a hobby. It felt like a direct metaphor for what I was quietly trying to do with the rest of my life. I started taking long walks through a city I'd lived in for over a decade without ever really seeing it clearly. None of these were dramatic leaps. They were small, trembling steps, one after another, towards something I couldn't yet fully picture. By the second year, the anger had settled into something quieter, a genuine, determined focus. I'd spent my entire adult life supporting Mark's career and our family, and my own marketing degree had been sitting untouched for 2 decades. I enrolled in a digital marketing certification program. The oldest person in the room by at least 15 years, genuinely terrified most days, and genuinely determined anyway. I landed an internship at a small startup, making coffee and doing the least glamorous work available, listening carefully in every meeting I was allowed to sit in on, volunteering for every project no one else wanted. Within a year, they offered me a full-time position. Over the following 3 years, I discovered something about myself I hadn't fully known before, that I was actually good at this work, creative and strategic in ways that surprised even me. I moved from coordinator to manager to director. I bought my own apartment, small and bright and entirely mine, filled with art I chose myself and books I actually wanted to read. I remember a specific moment, roughly 3 years into this new career, that captures how far I'd actually traveled from that woman sitting on her closet floor. I was leading a client presentation, something I would have found genuinely terrifying just a few years earlier, and midway through, I caught myself thinking, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that I wasn't nervous at all. I was simply doing my job, competently, in a room full of people who respected my expertise. I hadn't fully realized, until that exact moment, how completely I'd rebuilt the specific confidence Mark's departure had once stripped away so thoroughly. By the time 5 years had passed, I had a career that genuinely challenged me, a circle of friends who'd watched me at my absolute worst and stayed anyway, and a life that, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, belonged completely to me. I'd stopped thinking about Mark almost entirely. I certainly never expected to see him standing on my doorstep. That I want to share one more piece of that rebuilding period, something I haven't yet mentioned, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how much genuine healing had actually happened before Mark ever reappeared. About 3.5 years after the divorce, I dated someone seriously for nearly a year, a kind, steady man named Robert, the first met through a mutual friend. Robert was, in many ways, everything I might have said I wanted during those first raw months of grief: attentive, consistent, entirely uninterested in anyone younger or more exciting than the actual, complete person standing in front of him. That relationship ultimately ended, mutually and without any real bitterness, once we both recognized we wanted somewhat different things from the next chapter of our lives. But I mention it because it mattered enormously to my own healing, proof, delivered directly rather than theoretically, that I was fully capable of being loved well, by someone new, on my own actual terms rather than any terms shaped by what had happened with Mark. By the time Mark eventually appeared on my doorstep, I want to be clear that I wasn't a woman still secretly waiting for him, filling the years in between with a performance of moving on while quietly hoping for exactly this moment. I was a woman who had genuinely moved on, entirely, and who happened to open her door one evening to find her past standing there uninvited. I want to return now to that evening, because the actual conversation that followed was considerably stranger, in hindsight, than it felt in the moment. Mark stood there explaining, in a voice I remembered but that now sounded oddly rehearsed, that his life had unraveled over the preceding year. The relationship with the woman he'd left me for, I'll refer to her as Jessica, since that was, in fact, her name, had ended roughly 8 months earlier. According to him, once what he called the novelty had worn off for both of them. He talked about feeling lost, about a kind of identity crisis he hadn't anticipated, about finally, painfully understanding that our shared history together had been irreplaceable. I remember, specifically, the way he kept glancing past me into the house, taking in details, the artwork on the walls, the furniture, small signs of the life I'd built entirely without him, in a way that felt, even in the moment, slightly more assessing than purely nostalgic. He asked, at one point, how the marketing job was going, a detail I found genuinely surprising that he even knew about, since we hadn't spoken in 5 years and I had no idea how that information had reached him at all. I didn't think much of that specific detail at the time. I would think about it considerably more, later, once I understood the fuller context of why he'd actually come. I listened. I didn't interrupt. And I noticed, with a kind of clinical detachment that genuinely surprised me, that the rage and devastation I'd expected to feel simply weren't there anymore. In their place was something closer to calm observation, the specific sensation of watching a movie you've already seen enough times to know exactly how it ends. When he finally finished, he asked if he could come in, if we could just talk. I told him there was nothing to talk about. He looked genuinely confused, repeating that he'd made a mistake, that he missed me. I told him, and I remember this being the first time in 5 years I actually smiled thinking about him, that he didn't miss me, he missed the idea of me, the life he'd blown up, the woman who would have patched up his wounds and told him everything was fine. That woman, I told him, had died 5 years ago. He'd killed her himself. I was someone else now. He nodded, slowly, defeated, and turned to leave. I watched him walk to his car. And for a moment, I genuinely believed that was the end of it, a strange, uncomfortable evening, and then nothing more. I was wrong about that, though it would take 3 more weeks for me to understand exactly how wrong. That about 10 days after Mark's visit, I received a piece of mail that struck me as odd the moment I saw it, a letter from a collections agency I didn't recognize, addressed to both Mark and me jointly, referencing an account number tied to a home equity line of credit I hadn't thought about in years, one we'd opened together during our marriage and that I'd assumed, given our divorce settlement, had been fully closed and settled at the time. I called the number on the letter, more confused than alarmed at first, and spoke with a representative who informed me that the account in question showed a considerable outstanding balance, accrued through activity dated well after our divorce had been finalized, activity that, according to their records, had occurred using an authorized user designation that had apparently never been formally removed from the account. I sat with that phone call for a long time afterward, running back through the actual mechanics of our divorce 5 years earlier. I remembered discussing our joint accounts with our respective attorneys at the time, remembered believing, based on what I'd been told, that every shared financial obligation had been properly divided and closed. What I was now hearing suggested that at least one account, this one, had never actually been closed at all, simply left open and, apparently, quietly used. I called Mark directly, for the first time since that doorstep conversation, and asked him, without any preamble, whether he knew anything about a home equity account still active in both our names. There was a long pause on the line before he answered, a pause I recognized, even over the phone, as the specific sound of someone deciding how much of the truth to actually share. Mark told me, haltingly, a story considerably more complicated than the simple, romantic remorse he'd led with on my doorstep 3 weeks earlier. He said that during his relationship with Jessica, she had, at various points, asked to be added as an authorized user on several of his financial accounts, framing it, at the time, as a practical convenience for a couple building a shared life together. He said he hadn't thought much of it at the time, trusting her the way people early in a relationship often do, not realizing until considerably later that one of the accounts she'd gained access to was, in fact, the old joint home equity line still technically shared with me, one he said he'd genuinely forgotten remained open at all. He explained that Jessica had specifically requested this particular account added to her access, rather than any of his individually held accounts, a detail he said he hadn't found suspicious at the time, since she'd framed it as simply the account with the most available credit, useful for a joint renovation project on the apartment they were sharing. In hindsight, he admitted, that framing should have concerned him considerably more than it did, given how specifically she'd steered the conversation toward that one account over any of his others. He told me that over roughly the final year of their relationship, Jessica had drawn down that credit line substantially, using funds for purposes he said he still didn't fully understand or have complete visibility into, and that by the time their relationship ended 8 months earlier, he discovered not just her departure, but a financial situation considerably worse than he'd let on that evening on my doorstep, a significant debt attached to an account that, because it had never been formally closed during our divorce, still legally connected his financial obligations to mine. I asked him whether he'd confronted Jessica about the specific draws once he'd noticed them, and he admitted that he'd only fully reviewed the account's activity after she'd already left, discovering the extent of it in a single, devastating evening of reviewing statements he said he'd been avoiding looking at closely for months beforehand, a specific kind of avoidance I recognized, uncomfortably, as similar to my own avoidance of certain painful realities during our own marriage's final months. Mark described that evening to me in more detail than I probably needed, though I found myself listening closely anyway, some part of me genuinely curious what it looked like from his side to sit alone with a stack of financial statements and slowly understand the actual scope of what had happened to him. He said he'd felt a very specific, very particular kind of foolishness, one he told me he hadn't experienced since the earliest days after our own divorce, when the full weight of what he'd actually done to end our marriage had first started to sink in beyond the initial excitement of his new relationship. I asked him, directly, whether this was the actual reason he'd shown up at my door 3 weeks earlier. There was another long pause before he admitted, quietly, that while his feelings of regret about our marriage were genuine, he had also, separately, been advised by his own attorney that resolving the account status would likely require my cooperation, given that my name remained on the original agreement, and that he'd found himself unable to separate, even in his own mind, his genuine remorse from his practical need to eventually have this conversation with me regardless. I want to describe the specific, cold clarity that settled over me hearing that admission. The doorstep conversation, the tears, the confession about missing me, all of it had been genuine, I believe, in its own way. But it had also been, simultaneously, a convenient opening move in a considerably more practical conversation he'd known, the entire time, he eventually needed to have with me. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after he finished explaining all of this, running back through the entire doorstep conversation in my head with this new information layered underneath it. Every tearful admission, every mention of missing me, now carried a second, considerably less romantic possible reading alongside the first one. I didn't know, in that moment, which reading was more accurate, or whether both were simply true simultaneously, tangled together in a way neither of us could fully separate even if we tried. That I called an attorney the following morning, a careful, direct woman named Patricia who specializes in post-divorce financial disputes, a specialty I hadn't previously had reason to know existed but that turned out to be exactly what this situation required. I remember feeling a strange, specific reluctance calling Patricia's office that morning, a reluctance I recognized, uncomfortably, as similar to what I imagine kept Mark himself from confronting Jessica directly about the account for as long as he apparently did. There's a particular kind of avoidance that comes from not wanting a difficult situation to become more real by naming it out loud to a professional, and I had to push through a version of that same instinct before I finally made the call. Patricia explained something that reframed the entire legal shape of what I was dealing with. She told me that when joint accounts aren't formally closed or refinanced at the time of a divorce, both parties can remain legally liable for the account's obligations to the creditor, regardless of what a divorce decree itself states about how responsibility should be divided between the former spouses privately. The divorce decree, she explained, governs the relationship between Mark and me directly, but it doesn't automatically bind the actual creditor, who can still pursue either of us for the full outstanding balance if the account itself was never properly closed or transferred. She walked me through why this particular gap is so common, something I found oddly clarifying even amid everything else I was processing. Divorce decrees are negotiated and enforced between the two divorcing spouses, but the actual creditor holding a joint account was never a party to that divorce agreement at all, and has no legal obligation to honor its terms regarding which spouse is supposed to be responsible for what. Unless a joint account is formally closed, or unless the debt is formally refinanced into a single name with the creditor's direct cooperation, both original account holders typically remain jointly and severally liable to that creditor indefinitely, regardless of what any private divorce settlement says between the two people who signed it. This was, Patricia told me, an unfortunately common oversight in divorces where couples handle their own settlement negotiations without fully verifying that every joint account has actually been closed, rather than simply divided on paper. She requested the complete account history directly from the creditor, a process that took several weeks and revealed, in granular detail, exactly when Jessica had been added as an authorized user, and the specific pattern of draws made against the credit line during the final year of Mark and Jessica's relationship. Patricia's review confirmed something Mark himself likely hadn't fully understood or disclosed to me, that Jessica's draws on that account had escalated considerably in the final several months before she left the relationship, a pattern Patricia described as consistent, though not definitively provable without further investigation, with someone deliberately maximizing use of an account before an anticipated departure. Patricia also flagged something in the account records that struck her as particularly significant. Several of the larger draws had been transferred, within days, into accounts that didn't appear to belong to Jessica at all, based on the routing information visible in the creditor's own transaction logs, suggesting the funds may have moved further, to a third party neither Mark nor I had any way of identifying without considerably more extensive, and considerably more expensive, forensic tracing than either of us had appetite to pursue at that point. Patricia was careful to explain that this detail didn't change my own legal position regarding the account. But she noted it as the kind of loose thread that, in a case with higher financial stakes, might have warranted its own separate investigation. That I told my sister about the collections letter and everything that followed almost as soon as I understood the actual shape of it, largely because she'd been the person I'd called first 5 years earlier, sitting on my bathroom floor, and it felt right that she should be among the first to know how this final chapter was actually unfolding. Her first reaction was a kind of exhausted, disbelieving laughter, the specific sound of someone who genuinely couldn't decide whether to be angry or simply amazed at how thoroughly Mark's return had turned out to be layered with something other than pure sentiment. She reminded me, at one point during that call, of a conversation we'd had 5 years earlier, in the immediate aftermath of the divorce, where she'd told me she suspected Mark's departure had less to do with any grand, romantic pursuit of youth and more to do with a kind of ordinary, unglamorous midlife panic he simply hadn't known how to name honestly, even to himself. Hearing about the account situation, she said, felt like a strange, delayed confirmation of that same instinct, that whatever drove Mark's choices, then and now, tended to involve a considerable amount of avoidance and convenient self-narrative dressed up as something more romantic than it actually was. She asked me, directly, whether learning this changed how I felt about the confrontation at my door, about the things I'd said to him that night. I told her, honestly, that it didn't, not really. Everything I'd said about the woman I used to be no longer existing remained just as true regardless of what I later learned about his actual motives for showing up. If anything, understanding the fuller picture made me feel more confident, not less, that closing that door the way I had was exactly the right decision, made for exactly the right reasons, even before I had the complete story in front of me. I called Mark again once Patricia and I had reviewed the full account history together, and this conversation was considerably more direct than our first. I asked him whether he'd made any attempt, at any point, to formally investigate or restrict Jessica's access once he'd realized what was happening with the account. He admitted that he had noticed the balance climbing months before their actual breakup, but had avoided confronting her directly about it, worried, in his own words, about disrupting a relationship he was still, at the time, invested in preserving. I asked him whether he understood that his avoidance had directly extended the financial exposure now sitting on an account with my name still attached to it. He acknowledged that he did, and that this was, in fact, part of what had motivated him to finally come find me, not purely the debt itself, but a specific, growing guilt over having let this situation develop as long as it had without ever telling me the account was even still open. I asked him one final question that evening, one that had been sitting with me since Patricia first explained the situation. I asked whether Jessica had known, at any point, that the account she was drawing against still legally connected Mark to me. He said he genuinely didn't know, and that it was a question he hadn't been able to bring himself to ask her directly before she'd left, though he suspected, given how specifically the account had been targeted compared to his other, unshared accounts, that she likely had understood exactly what she was doing. I also asked him, directly, why he'd waited 3 weeks after his doorstep visit to actually tell me about any of this, rather than simply leading with it that first evening. He said he'd genuinely intended to raise it that night, but that once he was standing in front of me, actually looking at the life I'd built, the words about missing me and regretting our divorce had come out first, more sincerely than he'd expected, and that he'd lost his nerve to pivot into the more practical, considerably less romantic conversation he'd also come to have. I told him that made a certain kind of sense to me, even if it didn't make the omission any less significant. Genuine feelings and practical motives, I was learning firsthand, don't arrive in neatly separated packages, even when we'd both probably prefer they did. Patricia's negotiation with the creditor, once we'd assembled a clear picture of the account's actual usage history, focused on establishing that the overwhelming majority of the outstanding balance stemmed from draws made years after our divorce, by an authorized user I had never consented to and had no knowledge existed, rather than from any obligation I had actually incurred or benefited from. The creditor's own internal review, compelled through Patricia's formal dispute process, ultimately agreed to release me from continuing liability on the account, transferring full responsibility for the outstanding balance to Mark directly, a resolution that took several months to finalize but that Patricia described as the correct, appropriate outcome given how clearly the evidence showed the debt had been incurred entirely outside any activity or benefit on my part. The process itself required considerably more documentation than I'd initially anticipated, bank statements going back years, correspondence with the original divorce attorneys confirming what both Mark and I had actually understood about the account status at the time of our settlement, and a formal, notarized affidavit from me confirming I had never authorized, benefited from, or had any knowledge of the specific draws made during Mark and Jessica's relationship. Patricia warned me early on that creditors don't relinquish claims to a viable, still employed cosigner without genuine, documented pressure, and that the entire dispute process would likely take considerably longer than the emotional resolution I'd already reached with Mark himself. She was right. The financial resolution took nearly 4 additional months beyond the point where I'd already made my own peace with everything else this situation had revealed. I want to be honest that resolving the actual financial exposure, while necessary and important, was never the part of this entire ordeal that mattered most to me. What mattered more was the clarity it gave me about the true, layered nature of Mark's return to my doorstep 3 weeks earlier. Genuine regret, yes, tangled together with a practical, financial motive he hadn't been willing to name honestly until circumstances forced his hand. Mark, separately, made the decision to pursue his own legal consultation regarding Jessica's specific pattern of account usage, though he told me, in one of our final conversations during this process, that he'd ultimately decided not to pursue formal legal action against her directly, citing both the practical difficulty of proving deliberate intent and, I suspect, a genuine exhaustion with the entire chapter of his life she represented. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, feeling very little about that particular decision one way or the other. Whatever consequences Jessica did or didn't eventually face for her own choices, they existed, by that point, entirely outside the boundaries of what I needed to resolve for my own life to move forward cleanly. I've had considerable time since to sit with what actually happened that evening, and I don't think Mark was lying, exactly, when he said he missed me, or that our shared history felt irreplaceable to him. I think both of those things were true. I also think they were considerably more convenient truths to lead with than the actual, practical financial entanglement he knew, at some point during that conversation, he would eventually need to raise with me regardless of how I responded to anything else he said. I've thought, too, about the specific detail that first felt odd to me that evening but that I couldn't fully name at the time, the way his eyes moved around my house, cataloging details of the life I'd built, and the strange, specific fact that he already knew what my job was, 5 years after our last conversation. Information he could only have gotten from actively checking in on my life at some point during the years he claimed to have moved on from thinking about me at all. I don't know exactly when or how often he looked me up during those 5 years, and I've decided, deliberately, not to spend energy trying to reconstruct that timeline. What matters is that he was watching, at least occasionally, long before he ever needed anything from me directly, and that whatever brought him back that evening had clearly been building for longer than the sudden, spontaneous decision he initially presented it as. I think about how easily I could have let his tears and his apology fully define that entire conversation, how close I came to accepting his account of events at face value before that collections letter arrived and forced a considerably more complete picture into view. I don't think that would have been a foolish reaction on my part. His emotion, in the moment, felt entirely genuine. But I've learned, through this specific experience, that genuine emotion and complete honesty aren't always the same thing, and that a person can hold both real regret and real self-interest in the very same conversation without ever fully reconciling the two for themselves, let alone for you. I also think, often, about Jessica, a woman I never met and likely never will, who apparently understood something about that account's vulnerability that Mark himself either didn't notice or didn't want to confront directly. I don't know her actual intentions, and I've made peace with never fully knowing them. What I do know is that whatever happened in that relationship, its financial aftermath reached backward into my own life in a way I never once anticipated, 5 years after I believed that particular chapter had been permanently closed. There's a strange, specific irony in this entire situation that I've turned over often since. Mark left me for a promise of youth and excitement, and what he found, ultimately, was someone who understood the mechanics of financial vulnerability considerably better than he did, and who used that understanding against him in a way he never saw coming, the same way I never saw his own departure coming 5 years earlier. I don't take any particular satisfaction in that irony. I mostly just find it a sobering reminder that none of us are as protected from being blindsided as we'd like to believe, regardless of which side of a betrayal we happen to be standing on at any given moment in our lives. That I don't tell this story to suggest every ex who shows up expressing regret is secretly hiding a practical, self-interested motive underneath it. Most people who reach out years later are exactly what they appear to be, working through genuine, complicated feelings about a past relationship. What happened in my situation was its own specific, layered circumstance, genuine regret existing alongside a financial entanglement Mark hadn't been honest enough to name directly, until an outside creditor forced the entire truth into the open. I also want to say something directly to anyone listening who's currently in the position I was in 5 years ago, sitting on a closet floor not recognizing their own reflection. The specific, humiliating math of being replaced by someone younger, someone who seems to represent everything you feel you've lost simply by getting older, feels, in that moment, like the most important fact in the entire world. It isn't. I promise you, from the other side of it, that the actual measure of your worth was never up for debate in the first place, no matter how thoroughly someone else's choices might have made it feel that way. The specific, unglamorous work of rebuilding, the pottery class, the certification program, the unglamorous internship, matters far more than any single dramatic moment of vindication ever could, including the one that eventually showed up on my own doorstep 5 years later. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, it's simple. If you've gone through a divorce, verify directly with your creditors, not just your own memory of what your attorney told you, that every joint account has actually been closed rather than simply divided on paper. It costs very little time, and the alternative, as I learned 5 years after I believed that chapter of my life was fully finished, can resurface in ways you never anticipated. My healing was never actually about whether Mark came back, or why. It was about reaching a place where his return, and whatever complicated truth was actually underneath it, simply couldn't undo what I'd spent 5 years quietly building for myself. I closed that door behind him for the second time in my life, and this time, I understood completely, without a single doubt, exactly why. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that someone's return into your life carried a truth considerably more complicated than what they led with, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned about rebuilding a life entirely my own, every day.